and welcome to Delovely. This is a podcast featuring conversations with people who are creative, curious, and committed in finding ways to build whole communities. I'm Roy Gerstenberger, and this week, keeping the focus on the human with Joe Grabowski. Joe's been with the Upper Valley Services in Vermont for the past 5.5 years as a quality and technical leader, where he works with folks who have a disability, building connections and living a life that they choose. Before that, he was at Northern Human Services in New Hampshire. He's been a home provider, special educator, and case manager. He's also a pastor. I spoke with him recently about a presentation that he gave at a conference with Vermont Care Partners. It was about self-determined outcomes, and I'll let him give you the full title.
From a part to a part, facilitating community engagement is a self-directed outcome.
Joe and I met at a local coffee shop, the Local Buzz in Bradford, Vermont, and then found a quiet place at the Space on Main, which is a nonprofit community-based co-worker, maker, and gallery space. So let's jump into the conversation. I want to thank you, Joe, for joining me to have a conversation about the work that you're doing, and both with Upper Valley Services and I guess in your community as a whole.
Yeah, thank you for asking me to do this. This is another first for me.
Oh, great. So I was interested in learning more about some of the recent work that you're doing, which you had an opportunity to do some public presentations on the last Vermont Care Partners conference. And the title of that was, I believe, Self-Determined Outcome.
From a part to a part, facilitating community engagement is a self-directed outcome.
Wonderful. So tell me a little bit about what's involved with that process.
All right, well, look, first of all, it evolved out of just telling the stories of the gentleman that I was a home provider for in New Hampshire for 22 years, and another individual who's on my caseload here in Vermont that I served for 4 or 5 years, who both of whom they're very different men, but one came out of Brandon Training School in Vermont, one came out of Laconia State School in New Hampshire, similar age range, so similar life experience trajectory, except the gentleman in Vermont was very articulate, very strong self-advocate, and the gentleman who lived with me was very limited in his vocabulary. Both of them had some adverse behaviors, from eloping to aggression to acting out, but both of them had adverse behaviors, what we call adverse behaviors, and we focus on sometimes managing the behaviors in order to help somebody be in the program, so to speak. So the conference, the first part was just, again, touching on the history of institutionalization, kind of getting our heads around segregation and what institutions are and why we're talking about this to begin with. And we live, Vermont is very cutting edge on terms of community inclusion and having people be present and participating in the community. New Hampshire's on that same track, but there's still what I call institutional thinking. And that's kind of where I was talking about it, that's where it led us, was telling these stories and telling how stepping back, listening to the behavior and what it was informing about a person's individual wishes and choices, and honoring that and finding different ways to support that, because they had a right to engage in their community, had a right to express themselves. By doing that and moving away from being a program in itself, an end-all destination, to being a vehicle to the community and adapting it to their particular wishes, saw a significant decline in those adverse behaviors and a significant gain in life satisfaction, quality of life, belonging. So we talk a lot about inclusion itself as it's a destination, right? You're segregated, and then we get people integrated in the community and they're present, but they're not participants. And then they're participants, but they're not belonging. So the analogy I like to use, that I use this at the conference, that I think people can relate to, is whether it's school or work or other organizations where you're the new guy. You come in, you're excited about being there, you're nervous, you're overwhelmed, you don't know anyone, you don't know the system, you have a rough idea of what's involved, but you're an outsider. You're in, but you're still the outsider. You're the new guy. It feels like forever you're going to fit in. Hopefully at school or at work, you got somebody who comes alongside you and says, hey, my name's John. Hey, I can show you around here. I've been working for so long. This is so-and-so. Here's where we keep this. This is where you go if you need this information. Be encouraged. You're doing a great job. And that's good. That's really helpful because that helps us to acclimate to the culture. But again, following the illustration is that if you were to go forward 2, 3, 4 years and you still had that coworker standing beside you and saying, oh, you're doing a great job, and hovering over you, at that point you'd be like, okay, we're peers now. I'm not the new guy anymore.
So you're talking about presence, participation, but then belonging.
Belonging,
So
becoming one of us.
Yes. And the role, what you're pointing out here is the role of helping somebody go from participation to belonging is one that can sometimes get in the way, but sometimes support. So it's that nuanced approach.
And the idea too isn't to then get the new person to completely fit in to the culture, to conform, but to really recognize what this individual brings to the table.
So adding to the culture.
You're right, to the unique strengths and knowledge and skills that this person brings, and how their presence here kind of increases the overall value. Right? So I see the same thing with community now. There's some folks we serve that are, they're always going to need to have a staff person with them. But I'm always trying to think in terms of as much as possible as we're talking about self-direction and self-determination and supported decision-making, and as much as possible really empowering people to make those natural friendships and relationships that, just like on an employment site, we might help somebody get a job, learn what's involved, connect with their employer, and then fade back. And you think in terms of, let's do what we can to help somebody connect with their community, and then let's fade back, our supports.
So fading is a critical element.
Yeah. So, and even so, I've been places where I've seen very clearly staff and client. There's this dynamic where body language, or whether somebody in the community is talking directly to the staff person and not, so the person's present, but you can check it off on a piece of paper saying, oh yeah, we went to the community today, but.
And their presence makes them actually stand out.
Right.
And how do you work with that? How do you mitigate that appearance of sort of being the helper, or whatever the case may be, and interfering?
So I think it's important to really reinforce with staff, again, using that kind of imagery of like, hey, you remember that first day you were in school, you moved and didn't know anyone, you didn't want attention drawn to yourself. This is the new guy. You wanted to kind of be in the mix. So if we're supporting people in the community, rather than somebody looking at us and hypothetically and saying, oh, there's a staff and a client, that maybe people think like, oh, there's 2 friends out. Or even better, people don't think anything about it at all because it's just part of the regular everyday flow of community life.
So is this is an analogy that you give to new staff who come in?
Yeah, periodically. It's not a formal one, but a lot of times I'm sitting and talking with staff, especially people who are new into the system, into thinking about supporting people. There's no textbooks to it, but what would you do if you had a new friend in town and you kind of wanted to get to know them and get them used to the area and help them connect with things that they may find interesting? How would you do that? Do the same, or if it was you, what would you like?
Yeah. And then the next phase is fading out. Is that a challenge to figure out that?
So that's a challenge for a number of reasons, and that goes back to the institutional thinking piece, because even as much as we're progressive, on the clinical levels at our agencies and the state level about self-determination and dignity of risk and client rights, and that's a foreign language to the community members. All they see is we are an agency that provides services to people who are vulnerable, and so there's this kind of almost unspoken, maybe even unconscious perception that people need to have people with them. You sometimes hear those people, or you do great work. And so part of our role is to, again, kind of really help bring the community along of like, this isn't just people to be tolerated or you feel good about because like, oh, we hired this guy with a disability. We're our brother's keepers. We all look out for one another. There's a quote from George Washington Carver, that's kind of my email thing that just guides it. And he said, how far you go in life depends on your being tender with the young, compassionate with the aged, sympathetic with the striving and tolerant of the weak and strong, because someday in your life you will have been all of these.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
It's the idea that it's a natural part of what it means to be human.
Yeah. And I think that underscores the importance of the work that we do, just as we again, it's nothing new and radical, but what we advocate for others today is hopefully what we'll gain the benefits of later on in life when we're vulnerable.
Right.
So if we're actively working, if we, in our spheres of influence, towards an inclusive society, then as we age, or hospitalization, or accident, or whatever else puts us in the care of another, then hopefully some of the seeds we've sown today will bear the fruit tomorrow. That will help us to live a better quality of life and with dignity. So it's we do it just because it's the right thing to do. Because everybody has worth and value, regardless of their disability. I know we have to do it, but to a degree, I think it's unfortunate that we gauge intelligence based upon the cognitive intelligent quotient scale. There's a man, Howard Gardner, who has a book called Multiple Intelligences, in which he proposes that there's different types of intelligence in addition to traditional, and there's spatial, people who are good at dancing or sports, there's interpersonal, and there's the mechanical, and there's musical, there's different types of abilities. And I wish I had the other quote in front of me, but there's another quote that says, don't judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, and in the illustration there's a cartoon picture that says our modern school system. It's an older one. There's a man behind a desk, and there's like a seal and a monkey and a bird and an elephant, and he says, okay, the test of intelligence is to climb that tree. Of course the monkey's smiling because he knows he's got it, and the dolphin's despairing. So again, I think it's kind of good for all of us, whether we're the paid staff, people in the community, to really get in our heads. We each bring something unique to offer. Every single person we serve, even though they're labeled disabled, brings something unique, has a unique strength and talent and something to contribute. So those of us who are paid to work with them, it's kind of our job to kind of be that example of friendship, of what that looks like, to get to know somebody and to discover what makes them unique.
So getting to know somebody and discovering what makes them unique. This is the point in the conversation where Joe was able to give examples of people that he has been supporting. And he had an interesting way to start off.
What makes your life good?
What makes my life good is, I think, both relationships, and I think largely of family. That seems to be the strongest, but the opportunity to be in a relationship. And the other, I think the enjoyment of life, things like music, and arts and reading and politics, that sort of thing, culture.
Yeah. So there's a purpose for me asking that, besides the whole building relationship piece.
Yeah.
Is so the gentleman I was talking about that lived in Vermont, who very strong self-advocate, and he knew his rights, and he eloped and he caused problems. But when we stepped back and started giving him that room, affording him that room to do what he wants, he didn't want the staffing. He wanted independence, but we had some challenges with that. The community received him. He was a kind of community oddball character, but they loved him. But their perceptions was, because he was in public without staff and sometimes appearing unkempt and saying he didn't have money or food, the perception was that those of us who are the agency should be making him take a shower, should be making sure he's got food and money, when he learned very early on from the state school that if you presented yourself a certain way, somebody took pity on you or gave you something extra. So it worked very well for him. And one of the things, he loved to scratch tickets. So periodically when somebody would say to me, and they would go through, and I get the call, and I would listen and say, thank you for expressing your concern. But I'd say, eventually they all knew he liked scratch tickets. And I said, why do people play scratch tickets? When they're going to spend more money than they would win. Well, because one of those is a winner. I said, right. So if he's in town and he's like, oh, I don't have money and I don't have, somebody is going to say, you poor guy, and buy him what he wants, and he feels, hit the payday.
Yeah.
And it's very charming and stuff, but that was a recurrent thing. So that was a problem that wasn't something that we could necessarily address through a system. So this is kind of one of my, why we're talking about these things and the training.
Yeah.
Is saying we can hold the philosophies and values. I looked it up, Vermont Department of Aging and Independent Living, Disabilities, Aging and Independent Living, Dale. The mission is to make Vermont the best state in which to grow old or live with a disability with dignity, respect, and independence. There's our why right there. Upper Valley Services provides opportunity, support, and assistance to people with developmental disabilities, enabling them to safely live, work, and socialize in their communities in ways which are based upon their individual needs, values, interests, and choices. So there's all the why we do this. We can embody, we can embody the philosophy and values. That can be part of our DNA. Mm-hmm. That can be our mission, right? We can empower the people we serve, telling them, you have the right to enter the community. Nobody can make you do this. You segregate. We can empower them. We can inform them with choices and with options. We can support them to go be present in the community and participate in the life of the community, right? We can educate our staff on how to do this, right?
Yeah.
But unless the community's receptive,
right,
there's still a barrier.
Yes.
And so going back to the gentleman and talking about that was the barrier, is people loved him. He had lots of people, but the perception was he should have 24-hour staff, and and sometimes I would say, well, again, in order to do that without sharing too much information about him, is that we would have to keep him in some locked away thing with higher staff ratio, and then have a plan with eloping, so he'd be safer.
Yeah.
But his quality of life, from his perspective, would suffer.
Right. So Joe and Upper Valley Services figured this out in a different way. We'll continue this conversation at the next episode of the Delovely Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. This has been a production of Firstperson Services, and I'm Roy Gerstenberger. Be well, everyone.